Welcome to the History Maps podcast. If you look at a standard Western blueprint, there is generally a certain expectation of pure utility.
Right, you look at the lines on the paper, and they basically just show walls, doors, a foundation.
Yeah, a roof to keep the rain out.
Exactly. The architect points at the paper and essentially says, there is the shelter.
It is very binary. You are either inside or outside, functional or non-functional.
And that is the traditional way we categorize spaces in the physical world. I mean, it makes a building very easy to parse. You know exactly what the structure is meant to do in a purely physical sense.
But what if a blueprint was not designed just to shelter a physical body? What if it was built to actively alter a state of mind?
Well, when you step into the world of Islamic architecture, that simple binary blueprint completely falls apart.
Right, because you are no longer looking at pure engineering. You are stepping into a spatial landscape that operates as theology translated into stone, brick, and geometry.
It is a physical record of a massive cultural expansion. To really understand these structures, you have to read them as documents of cultural exchange.
And deeply ingrained religious principles.
Yes, and of imperial ambition. It is a tradition that spans from the Iberian Peninsula all the way to Southeast Asia.
And what becomes immediately apparent when you look at the source material is that it is not a single unified style.
Not at all. There is no one single aesthetic that defines it perfectly across all borders.
So today we are undertaking a detailed exploration of Islamic architecture as part of our History of Architecture series.
We have texts, architectural surveys, and historical records spanning from the early 7th century all the way to the modern day.
And the mission for this deep dive is to understand how a shared set of underlying principles adapted to radically diverse climates, cultures, and technologies.
We are going to see how specific restrictions on certain types of visual imagery forced builders to channel their creativity into entirely new, abstract forms of expression.
But to see how that happened, we really have to strip away the massive empires and the towering stone domes.
Right. We have to look at the foundation. The absolute baseline precedent for what a mosque fundamentally needed to be was established in the year 622.
Which brings us to the Prophet's Mosque in Medina.
Yeah, and when you read the historical descriptions of its original form, it is notable how humble it was.
There was absolutely nothing monumental about it.
No, it was built for pure utility. The structure featured a large open courtyard and a covered prayer area where the roof was quite literally supported by palm trunks.
So it was essentially a domestic courtyard adapted for communal gathering.
Exactly. It did not have a soaring dome or complex vaults, but what it did establish was the core spatial DNA of the mosque.
You need a space large enough to hold the community for congregational prayer, and you need that space to be oriented in the proper direction.
Right, and that simple division between the bright, open, unroofed courtyard and the shaded, covered sanctuary well, that became the structural skeleton for almost every major mosque built over the next 1,000 years.
So the functional requirements were set. But as the religion rapidly expanded over the next few decades, the buildings became more permanent.
And the wealth of new empires allowed for elaborate decoration.
And here is where the architecture takes a radically different path from what was happening in Europe or the Byzantine Empire.
Yeah, a very specific theological rule dictated exactly how these new wealthy structures could be decorated. We have to look at the concept of aniconism.
Right. Aniconism is the prohibition on idolatry. And in this specific context, it meant a strict avoidance of creating images of sentient beings in sacred spaces.
Humans and animals, primarily. The underlying theological concern was deeply practical for a new monotheistic faith.
Because depicting living figures, especially prophets or leaders, could easily lead worshippers to venerate the image itself.
Exactly, rather than focusing their devotion entirely on the formless, infinite divine.
So if you are an artist or an architect working in this period, you have incredible wealth at your disposal.
And you have immense creative energy.
But you are told you cannot carve statues of victorious rulers.
Right, you cannot paint elaborate murals depicting historical battles or faces of holy figures.
In many traditions, restricting human and animal forms might stifle artistic output.
But here, restricting that specific avenue of human creativity did not extinguish the art.
It acted almost like a nozzle on a hose, forcing the artistic energy out with immense pressure into the realm of abstraction.
That is a good way to put it. The historical record shows that this theological restriction channeled visual expression into three primary decorative pillars.
And those are intricate geometric patterns, arabesques, and Arabic calligraphy.
Let us examine those three pillars, starting with the geometry. We are not talking about a few simple intersecting lines on a wall.
No, we are talking about highly complex mathematical grids that interlock and repeat.
The geometry deployed on these walls is profoundly philosophical.
By creating these incredibly complex, interlocking star and polygon patterns, often starting from a single circle and using just a compass and a straight edge, the artists were visually representing the concept of divine order.
Because mathematics is universal, it is pure. And crucially, these geometric patterns are designed so that they have no natural boundary.
They can theoretically extend infinitely in any direction beyond the frame of the arch or the wall.
Right. They are intended to foster a sense of the infinite scale of the universe, prompting you to contemplate a reality far larger than yourself.
So the second pillar provides a contrast to that strict mathematical discipline, the arabesques.
Yes, these are described in the sources as vegetal motifs, so scrolling vines, leaves, and interlacing stems.
While the geometry provides the underlying structural grid, the arabesque provides the organic rhythm.
It represents the life-giving, sustaining aspect of nature, but it is heavily stylized.
Right, an arabesque does not depict a specific recognizable plant like an oak leaf or a grapevine.
No, instead your eye follows a stem, which splits, crosses over another stem, sprouts an abstract leaf, and then loops back on itself in a continuous, unbroken rhythm.
It is basically nature distilled into pure flowing energy.
And finally, we have the third pillar, which is calligraphy.
The texts mention angular Kufic scripts, which have very sharp horizontal baselines, used to write Quranic verses directly into the stone and tile.
Calligraphy rapidly became the most esteemed visual art form of the three.
Because it serves as the physical manifestation of the Word of God.
Exactly. When an architect integrates script into the friezes, wraps it around the arches, and carves it along the cornices, the building itself is effectively speaking the theology.
The architecture becomes a readable text.
So, for a worshiper standing inside one of these early spaces, the visual experience is entirely distinct from standing in a contemporary Western cathedral.
Is it fair to say this architectural style functions as a language of mathematics and text, explicitly rejecting any visual anchor to the physical world?
That is exactly the mechanism at work. In a traditional Byzantine church or later Gothic cathedral, your eye is deliberately drawn to a focal point.
You are meant to look at a statue of a saint, or a mosaic of an emperor.
Or a stained glass narrative of a specific biblical scene.
Yeah.
The architecture frames a distinct subject for you to look at.
But in these Islamic spaces, the decoration is explicitly designed so your eye never finds a resting place.
You walk up to a wall covered in an arabesque pattern, and your eye traces a single looping vine.
You try to follow it to its end, but the line just weaves under another stem and loops back into the larger grid.
And you look at the geometric stars, and they just expand outward into smaller stars. The visual lack of a single resting place is entirely intentional.
It is an architecture of infinite surface rather than narrative focus.
Because your eye cannot lock onto a specific face or a specific scene, the visual input essentially becomes a mantra.
It shifts your focus inward, moving you away from the physical world and toward a direct, unmediated contemplation.
So with the underlying philosophy of the decoration established, we can look at the physical structures themselves.
We should shift to the universal vocabulary of the sacred space.
Because while the decoration was highly abstract, the physical components of the mosque became highly standardized across incredibly diverse regions.
And the most critical component of this vocabulary is the qibla.
Yes, the qibla is the fundamental orienting principle of the architecture. It is the wall of the mosque that faces Mecca.
Every single mosque, regardless of whether it is built in Spain, Syria, or Indonesia, must align its internal prayer space toward that single geographic coordinate.
The entire floor plan, the entire structural layout, revolves around identifying and emphasizing the qibla wall.
To ensure that anyone walking into the space immediately knows which wall is the qibla wall, builders developed the mihrab.
The mihrab is a semicircular niche set directly into the qibla wall.
Now, there is significant historical debate regarding its exact origins.
Right. Some architectural historians suggest it originally had an acoustic function.
A curved surface to project the imam's voice back out to the congregation before the era of microphones.
But regardless of its practical origin, its primary function rapidly became purely symbolic and visual.
It acts as the architectural focal point of the interior.
And it usually receives the most elaborate decoration in the entire building. the most intricate cut tile work, the finest carved stucco, or the most precious marble.
Then we have the element that completely changes the exterior silhouette of the building, which is the minaret.
Initially, this was just a simple elevated position, maybe a small tower or the roof of the mosque itself, used for the call to prayer.
Functionally, you needed a high place, so the human voice could carry across a dense, noisy urban environment.
To call the community to gather. But structurally and symbolically, the minaret evolved into a massive vertical icon.
It became a visual marker that signaled the presence of the faith in a city's skyline.
If the prayer hall is a broad horizontal expanse, reflecting the equality of the worshippers standing shoulder to shoulder, the minaret is the vertical counterpoint.
Drawing the eye upward. We also have the San, which brings us back to that original courtyard in Medina.
The San is the open courtyard attached to the prayer hall. It serves multiple practical and spiritual functions,
It often contains a fountain or a central pool for ritual ablution.
which is the physical purification that is required before entering the prayer hall.
But architecturally, it acts as a critical transition zone.
You step off a busy, secular, dusty street and enter the San. It is an open-air space, filled with light, often quite serene.
It allows you to decompress and physically separate from the profane world before you move into the shaded, solemn, carpeted interior of the prayer hall.
The builders also heavily utilized domes, which created expansive interiors without needing a dense forest of columns to hold up a flat roof.
Domes solve a practical engineering problem of covering a large span, but they also carry deep cosmological weight.
Yes, a dome acts as a structural canopy, a direct architectural representation of the vault of heaven.
But building a circular dome creates a massive geometric problem, which leads us to one of the most uniquely identifiable elements in this architectural tradition.
Muqarnas.
Right. To understand muqarnas, we need to look at the structural problem it solves.
If you build a square room with 4 straight walls and you want to place a perfectly circular dome on top of it, the base of the circle will only touch the walls at the center of each side.
You're left with 4 empty, unsupported corners.
Historically, Roman and Byzantine builders solved this geometry problem using squinches or penentives.
Think of a pendentive like trying to fit a round lid onto a square container.
You have to create curved, triangular pieces of solid masonry that bridge those 4 empty corners.
Creating an octagonal base that can properly support the circular rim of the dome
Is heavy, solid, load-bearing engineering.
But what the architects of the Islamic world did with muqarnas was take that heavy, solid masonry bridge in the corner and shatter it.
They fractured the solid squinch into 3-dimensional honeycomb geometry.
Muqarnas breaks that heavy structural transition down into light, fragmented cellular patterns.
It looks like hundreds of tiny cascading arches or stalactites stacked intricately on top of each other.
Visually, it is very distinct. It looks like the masonry is defying gravity.
And that is the philosophical point of the engineering. By utilizing muqarnas, the architects visually dissolved the structural load.
A massive multi-ton stone dome appears to rest not on heavy, load-bearing walls, but on a delicate, weightless lattice of lace.
It is the ultimate dematerialization of structure through intense geometric decoration.
Now, looking at the historical record, early Arab builders emerging from the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century did not have a pre-existing tradition of monumental stone architecture.
No, they were coming from environments where the early Muslim builders were incredibly pragmatic. They utilized the established structural techniques of the territories they absorbed.
In the western regions like Syria, Egypt, and North Africa, they adopted the stone columns, capitals, and arches of the Roman and Byzantine traditions.
And in the eastern regions, like Mesopotamia and Persia, they adopted the massive brick vaults and domes of the Sasanian tradition.
But if they are just taking Roman columns from abandoned temples and building Persian-style brick domes, at what point does this become a distinct architectural tradition?
That is a great question. How is it not just repurposed Roman and Persian buildings with different people inside?
Right. How does it become uniquely Islamic?
The distinction emerges not through the invention of entirely new raw materials, but through the application of the spatial requirements and the theology we just discussed.
Consider a Roman basilica. It is designed for a processional liturgy.
The architecture guides you down a long, narrow central nave toward a single altar at the far end. It is highly directional and hierarchical.
A mosque requires the exact opposite.
It requires a broad, horizontal space where everyone can stand shoulder to shoulder in long rows facing the Qibla wall. There is no procession.
So the builders took those Roman columns, but instead of lining them up to form a nave, they rearranged them into vast, broad, hypostyle halls.
Essentially a grid of columns spreading outward in all directions.
And they took the Sasanian dome, but instead of covering it in murals of Persian kings, they covered it in aniconic infinite geometry.
The physical vocabulary was inherited, but the syntax, the way the pieces were put together, was completely rewritten to serve a new ritual and a new worldview.
That transition from inheriting the pieces to rewriting the syntax leads us chronologically to the first major empires that deployed these elements on a monumental scale.
We look first at the Umayyad era, which ran from 661 to 750.
The Umayyads established their political capital in Syria, in Damascus.
And because they were situated right in the heart of the former Roman and Byzantine eastern provinces, their early architecture exhibits heavy Mediterranean influence.
They had access to skilled stonemasons, so they constructed large, impressive structures using dressed stone.
The most famous example from this period is the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, completed around 692.
The Dome of the Rock is an absolutely critical monument, but the sources note that it is not a mosque in the traditional congregational sense.
No, it is a martyrium, or a shrine, built to enclose a sacred rock outcropping. The floor plan is a concentric octagon.
So you have the rock in the center, covered by the wooden dome, and then two octagonal aisles wrapped around it,
This specific plan is derived directly from Byzantine martyria.
which were shrines built over the tombs of saints.
That circular concentric layout is designed specifically for circumambulation, allowing pilgrims to walk in circles around the central relic.
But the Umayyads utilized this Byzantine form to create a monumental, assertive statement of the new faith in a city that was already heavily layered with Jewish and Christian monumental architecture.
The interior is covered in intricate mosaics. The craftsmen used traditional Byzantine glass mosaic techniques, but the imagery is entirely different.
Instead of figures, the mosaics feature stylized vegetal motifs, crowns, and jewels, alongside extensive Arabic calligraphy, consciously avoiding the figurative narratives typical of Byzantine churches.
The political landscape shifts dramatically in 750.
The Abbasid era begins, and they move the geopolitical center of gravity far to the east, into Iraq, establishing capitals in Baghdad and later Samarra.
And this geographical shift fundamentally altered both the aesthetic and the engineering methods of the empire.
Because in Mesopotamia, which is the sprawling floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates, you do not have the massive limestone quarries that you have in Syria.
Stone is scarce.
So you cannot build a massive Umayyad-style stone monument if you do not have stone.
Right, so the Abbasid builders relied heavily on the indigenous building material of the river valleys, which was mud and baked brick.
This forced reliance on brick led to different structural solutions.
Instead of slender stone columns supporting light wooden roofs, they used heavy brick vaults, massive brick piers, and thick walls.
Now, if you are building with stone, you can carve intricate details directly into the block. But how do you decorate a massive complex built out of baked brick?
Carving complex geometry into hard-fired brick seems incredibly labor-intensive.
It is entirely impractical to carve intricate patterns into miles of brick walls.
To decorate these massive new structures, the Abbasids turned to stucco, which is a thick plaster.
They would coat the rough brick walls in a thick layer of wet stucco and then carve the decorative patterns into the plaster while it was still workable and soft.
This material constraint led to a very specific artistic innovation known as the beveled style.
The Abbasids were building on an unprecedented scale. The city of Samarra was a sprawling palatial complex that stretched for miles along the river.
They needed to decorate vast surface areas quickly.
The beveled style is a technique where the carving is slanted, or beveled, at a shallow angle, rather than cut straight down with deep, sharp undercuts.
This allowed craftsmen to execute deep, rhythmic, abstract, and heavily stylized vegetal patterns over immense spaces very rapidly.
So the aesthetic was born directly out of a material necessity and the sheer speed required for imperial expansion.
The scale of Samarra is massive, and it produced one of the most recognizable structures of the era, the spiral minarets.
The Great Mosque of Samarra features a freestanding tower made entirely of baked brick with a ramp spiraling up the outside of the cone.
It looks completely distinct from the square stone towers the Umayyads were building in Syria.
It echoes the ancient ziggurats of Mesopotamia, demonstrating how deeply the pre-Islamic indigenous building traditions of the Iraqi plains influenced Abbasid design.
The Abbasids also began to integrate educational and social functions, like madrasas or theological schools, into their complexes, vastly expanding the civic footprint of the architecture.
As the Abbasids were building these massive brick cities in the east, the western fringes of the Islamic world were developing a highly distinct, refined architectural dialect.
We moved to the Iberian Peninsula and North Africa, exploring Moorish architecture.
This covers the region known historically as Al-Andalus, encompassing modern-day Spain and Portugal, and the Maghreb in northwest Africa.
Because they were geographically isolated from the Abbasid center in Baghdad, a very specific, continuous regional style flourished here for centuries.
A prime example of this era is the Great Mosque of Cordoba, initially built in the late 8th century.
When you look at the interior of Cordoba, it is defined by a visual rhythm that is completely hypnotic.
It is a vast, horizontal space filled with endless rows of columns supporting double-tiered arches.
The engineering behind those arches is a perfect example of pragmatic problem-solving, leading to brilliant aesthetics.
When the builders started constructing the mosque in Cordoba, they reused hundreds of marble columns from older Roman and Visigothic structures in the area.
The problem was that these recycled columns were relatively short.
If they just rested the roof directly on top of those short columns, the ceiling of this massive prayer hall would be uncomfortably low and oppressive.
So to raise the ceiling height, they engineered a two-tiered system of arches.
They placed a tall rectangular pier on top of the column capital.
From the capital, they sprang a lower arch, which acts as a lateral brace, tying all the columns together to prevent them from shifting.
Then, from the top of the taller pier, they sprang a second, higher arch, which actually supports the weight of the timber roof.
And the arches themselves are visually striking. They are constructed using alternating red brick and white stone voussoirs.
Voussoirs are the wedge-shaped blocks that fit together to form the curve of an arch.
By alternating the red-baked brick with the white stone, the builders created a vibrant, striped visual rhythm that draws the eye endlessly down the long aisles of the prayer hall.
Furthermore, they utilized the horseshoe arch.
Instead of dropping straight down into a semicircle like a standard Roman arch, the horseshoe arch pinches inward slightly at the base.
It creates a profile that is slightly more than a half circle, which looks less heavy and more dynamic.
The builders in Al-Andalus and the Maghreb did not stop at the horseshoe arch. Over the centuries, they began playing with the structural form of the arch itself, treating it almost like a purely decorative element.
We see the development of the polylobed arch and the lambrequin arch.
A polylobed arch takes the inner curve of a standard arch and breaks it up into a series of smaller, repeating curves or lobes.
The lambrequin arch pushes this concept even further. It creates highly complex, lace-like patterns with intricate stalactite profiles dangling from the curve.
The arch ceases to look like a heavy piece of masonry supporting a wall, begins to look like heavy fabric hanging in a doorway, or intricately carved ivory.
It was the same philosophy we saw with muqarnas, the total dematerialization of heavy structure.
They also made heavy use of a decorative element called the sebka motif, an intricate tile work known as zellage.
The sebka motif is a continuous grid of interlacing, diamond-shaped arches that covers blank wall spaces.
It is often executed in carved stucco or brick, creating a delicate texture of light and shadow across the upper facades of buildings, like the Giralda in Seville.
Zellage refers to the incredibly intricate cut-tile mosaic work that typically covers the lower portions of walls and pillars.
Craftsmen would chisel individually colored glazed tiles into tiny, exact geometric shapes and assemble them into complex star patterns in vibrant greens, blues, yellows, and blacks.
Moorish architecture also heavily features distinct domestic and palace architecture, specifically the riad.
A riad is a traditional Moroccan house or palace built entirely around an interior courtyard garden.
What is fascinating is how the riad represents a continuous dialogue between the indigenous Berber traditions of North Africa, which emphasized adapting to the harsh climate, and the refined Andalusian innovations from Spain.
When you walk down a street and look at a riad from the outside, it is often just a blank, towering, windowless earth or plaster wall.
The street facade offers almost nothing. Is this intense inward focus entirely a response to the harsh North African climate, or is it driven by a cultural emphasis on domestic privacy?
It is inextricably both. You cannot separate the engineering from the culture.
In a hot, arid climate, minimizing exterior windows keeps the harsh, baking sun and street dust out of the living spaces.
The interior courtyard, which is open to the sky and often features a central fountain and planted citrus trees, acts as a highly efficient microclimate regulator.
The water evaporates and cools the air.
That dense, cool air sinks into the courtyard, which naturally draws the hot air from the surrounding rooms up and out of the open roof.
It is natural air conditioning.
But culturally, the blank exterior wall ensures absolute visual privacy for the family.
The architectural focus is turned entirely inward, creating a private, serene, highly decorated space that is completely hidden from the public sphere of the street.
From the intimate, inward-looking gardens of the Maghreb, we pivot back toward the Eastern Mediterranean and the Levant.
We examine two later empires that competed directly for prestige and legitimacy through massive engineering feats.
The Mamluks of Egypt and Syria, and the Ottomans of Anatolia.
This era brings us to the imperial giants.
The Mamluks ruled from 1250 to 1517, and their architectural legacy is concentrated heavily in Cairo, as well as cities like Damascus and Aleppo.
Their building style is characterized by monumental, heavy stone construction and intense urban density.
A prime example often cited is the complex of Sultan Hassan in Cairo, built in the mid-14th century. It is known for its incredible scale.
To understand Mamluk architecture, you have to understand medieval Cairo.
The Mamluks were not building vast horizontal courtyard mosques on open tracts of land. They were building in a severely crowded, winding, densely packed urban environment.
To make a visual and political impact in a city where horizontal space was unavailable, they had to build vertically.
The complex of Sultan Hassan is a towering structure. Because they could not build wide, they built high, utilizing deep, soaring iwans.
Let us clearly define what an iwan is in this context.
An iwan is a massive vaulted hall that is walled on three sides, with one end entirely open, facing directly into a central courtyard.
The Sultan Hassan complex uses a classic four-iwan plan, where four of these massive vaulted halls form a cross shape, opening onto the central san.
The stonework is incredibly heavy and assertive.
The Mamluks built monumental entrance portals that towered over the narrow streets, recessed deeply into the stone facades, and capped with staggering, intricate muqarnas hoods that cast deep shadows over the doorways.
So the Mamluk aesthetic is heavy, carved stone facades dominating the narrow, dusty streets of Cairo, projecting power and mass.
Now, contrast that heavy verticality with the architecture of the Ottomans in Anatolia.
The Ottomans, who eventually conquered the Mamluk Empire in 1517, developed a radically different spatial concept.
When the Ottomans captured Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, in 1453, they inherited the Hagia Sophia.
The Byzantine Hagia Sophia, with its massive centralized dome floating over a vast nave, deeply influenced Ottoman architectural ambition.
The Ottomans essentially took the concept of the centralized dome and obsessed over perfecting it.
And the architect who defined this era was Mimar Sinan.
Mimar Sinan is the master of the Ottoman classical style.
Over a long career in the 16th century, his primary architectural goal was the engineering perfection of the centralized, unified dome space.
If you look back at the early hypostyle mosques like Cordoba, the internal space is fragmented by hundreds of columns. Your view is constantly blocked.
Sinan wanted the exact opposite. He wanted a single, vast, unencumbered interior volume where the entire congregation could gather under one massive, unbroken canopy.
We look closely at his work on the Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, built between 1550 and 1557.
The engineering challenge is immense. To achieve a massive central space without the dome collapsing under its own weight, you have to manage the lateral thrust.
Which is the weight of the dome pushing outward.
Rather than building massive, blocky, solid stone walls to hold that weight up, Sinan utilized a brilliant system of cascading half-domes.
So the weight of the massive central dome pushes outward, and it rests on smaller half-domes, which then push the weight outward onto even smaller semi-domes, cascading the structural load down step by step to the ground.
Precisely. The building acts like a structural waterfall.
And because the weight is being pushed outward and down through this complex exterior cascade of domes and buttresses, the walls directly under the main arches of the central dome do not have to bear the heavy structural load.
And if those walls are not load-bearing, they don't have to be solid stone.
Exactly. Sinan could pierce those non-load-bearing walls with hundreds of windows.
This floods the massive interior volume with natural light. The central dome appears to float above a ring of light, defying the immense tonnage of the stone.
And on the exterior, they surround these cascading domes with incredibly tall, pencil-thin minarets.
It gives Ottoman mosques their unmistakable needle-like skyline silhouettes that define Istanbul to this day.
The interior decoration also shifted significantly during the Ottoman period, We see the extensive use of bright Iznik tiles in the interiors.
These glazed tiles brought vibrant deep blues, vivid tomato reds, and highly naturalistic floral patterns into the mosques.
Specifically, tulips, carnations, and hyacinths.
This was a notable departure from the strictly geometric and abstract arabesques of the earlier Arab periods, introducing a much brighter, more colorful, and botanical aesthetic.
So if we look at the two empires side by side, the Mamluk complex is a heavily carved, dense stone forest, integrated tightly into crowded street facades, focused on intricate stone masonry.
And the Ottoman mosque, on the other hand, is designed to feel like a single, massive, weightless canopy, a masterclass in volumetric engineering that dominates the skyline.
That is a clear contrast. Mamluk architecture asserts monumental mass in a dense urban fabric, while Ottoman architecture achieves a vast, luminous, centralized interior volume encased in a cascading exterior profile.
Continuing our geographical journey eastward, we explore how Persian influences gave rise to some of the most famous structures in the world on the Indian subcontinent.
We look at the Eastern mastery.
In Iran and Central Asia, particularly during the Timurid period in the 14th and 15th centuries, the architecture became entirely defined by its skin.
Specifically, the extensive, dazzling use of brilliant blue glazed tiles and faience mosaics.
We see structures like the Blue Mosque in Tabriz. The color is overwhelming.
In this region, craftsmen mastered the incredibly painstaking art of faience mosaic.
They would fire differently colored glazed tiles and then use small hammers and chisels to cut those tiles into tiny, exact puzzle pieces.
They assembled these pieces to create massive, vibrant, mathematically flawless geometric and calligraphic mosaics that covered entire building facades, massive domes, and towering minarets.
The predominant colors were deep cobalt and brilliant turquoise blue, reflecting the sky.
They also universally adopted the 4i1 plan that we saw the Mamluks use, but here it became the standard layout for sweeping open courtyards in mosques and madrasas, featuring soaring arched portals completely encased in blue tile.
Those deep Persian architectural forms, the iwans, the love of symmetry, the bulbous domes, traveled south into the Indian subcontinent with the Mughal emperors.
This cultural fusion leads to what is widely considered the peak of Indo-Islamic architecture.
The Mughals synthesized the Persian obsession with geometry, iwans, and domes with the indigenous Indian traditions of masterful stone carving, local materials like red sandstone, and native architectural elements like chatras.
Chatras being small, elevated, dome-shaped pavilions. We have to look deeply into the Taj Mahal, constructed between 1632 and 1653.
It is the most famous example of this synthesis, but what is truly fascinating is the strict adherence to Shahjahani architectural principles that made its precision possible.
Shah Jahan was the Mughal emperor who commissioned the Taj Mahal as a mausoleum for his wife.
His architectural projects were governed by an incredibly rigid, highly codified set of principles. The absolute core concept governing the entire complex is Karina,
which translates to bilateral symmetry along a central axis.
meaning if you draw a line straight down the center of the complex, the entire left side must perfectly mirror the right side.
It requires absolute mathematical and spatial discipline. To maintain this perfect visual balance, they went to extraordinary lengths.
For example, to the west of the central white marble tomb, there is a red sandstone mosque, built to serve the functional religious purpose of the site.
But to maintain Corina, they had to build an identical red sandstone building to the east of the tomb.
This building, known as the Jawab, or the answer, cannot be used for prayer because it faces away from Mecca.
It was built purely at immense expense to maintain perfect visual symmetry.
The builders also adhered to a strict hierarchical grading of materials.
Material choice in Shahjahani architecture was never arbitrary. It was a highly codified system used to convey status and guide the eye.
The pure, translucent white muqarnas marble was reserved exclusively for the main tomb, the focal point of the symmetry, and the resting place of the royalty.
The secondary structures, the mosque, the guest house, the monumental entrance gateways, the perimeter walls, were constructed in local red sandstone.
This creates a stark, immediate visual hierarchy that directs your eye inevitably to the center.
And there is the engineering of the riverfront garden design.
Instead of placing the main tomb in the exact center of a square walled garden, which was the traditional Persian layout, they place it at the far end of the garden, right on the edge of the Yamuna River.
By doing this, the entire garden forms a massive structured lead up to the tomb, and the tomb itself is framed only by the open sky behind it, rather than being blocked by trees or walls.
The precision is notable. The Mughals synthesize Persian forms with Indian stone carving traditions to produce monuments of proportional harmony.
The optical refinements, like the minarets leaning slightly outward so they appear perfectly straight from a distance and would fall away from the dome in an earthquake, show intense attention to detail.
Looking at that level of rigid control, does demanding absolute bilateral symmetry restrict an architect's creativity?
Does a strict blueprint stifle innovation, or does it actually provide a framework that forces the builders to perfect every single detail?
Paradoxically, severe restriction often distills creativity into refinement. When the overall layout is non-negotiable, it must be symmetrical, it must use specific materials, the architect's creative genius is channeled entirely into execution.
They focus on the exact perfection of the dome's sweeping curve, the microscopic precision of the floral marble inlay work using semi-precious stones, the delicate lace-like carving of the marble screens, and the flawless spatial relationships between the massive structural volumes.
The strict rules do not stifle the art, they elevate it.
This brings us to a major pivot in our exploration. We are moving away from empires of stone and marble, away from the wealth of the Ottomans and the strict symmetry of the Mughals.
We are looking at regions where Islamic architecture had to adapt to entirely different climates, available materials, and pre-existing local building traditions.
This transition highlights the adaptability of this architectural tradition. It proves that the architecture is not a rigid, unyielding aesthetic, but a highly adaptable system.
We can think of the fundamental requirements of the mosque: the Qibla orientation, the open space for communal prayer, the lack of figurative idols as a structural skeleton.
That skeleton is the unchanging core. But depending on where you build it, that skeleton can wear entirely different types of local clothing.
We see this clearly in sub-Saharan Africa, looking at the Sudano-Sahelian style, specifically the Great Mosque of Jan.
Jain is located in modern-day Mali. The environment in the Sahel is defined by intense, searing heat and a distinct, heavy, rainy season.
Furthermore, the primary building material available is earth. So the Great Mosque is constructed entirely of sun-baked mud brick coated in a thick layer of mud plaster.
When you look at the Great Mosque of Jain, it does not have the sharp, mathematically perfect geometric angles of a stone Mamluk mosque.
No, it has a smooth, undulating, organic, almost sculptural aesthetic.
Because earth architecture literally melts in the heavy rains, the building cannot be treated as a static, finished monument.
It requires constant active maintenance. To facilitate this, the builders incorporate torreon.
Torreons are bundles of palm wood beams that protrude horizontally from the mud walls. They look almost like wooden spikes sticking out of the sides of the building.
They are an integral, highly functional part of the architecture. They serve as permanent scaffolding.
Every year, after the rainy season washes away the outer layer of the mosque, the entire community gathers in a festival to apply a fresh layer of mud plaster to the building.
The young men climb up onto the torreons to reach the upper walls, while the elders mix the mud below.
The architecture here is not just a building. It is a living, continuous communal process that renews the social contract of the town every single year.
The clothing on the skeleton is mud, and it breathes with the seasons.
If we move to Southeast Asia, specifically Indonesia and Malaysia, the environment changes again drastically.
It is tropical, highly humid, with torrential monsoon rains and muddy coastal terrain.
Because of that specific climate, the traditional Middle Eastern or Persian masonry domes were completely impractical.
A heavy stone dome traps heat and moisture, and constructing massive stone foundations in soft, muddy soil is incredibly difficult.
Furthermore, a heavy flat roof would collapse under the sheer volume of monsoon rain.
So how do you build a space for communal prayer? You utilize the indigenous wooden architecture that has evolved to handle that exact climate.
If we look at structures like the Demak Grand Mosque in Java, they completely discard the dome.
Instead, they feature massive, multi-tiered, pyramidal wooden roofs, often raised on stilt foundations.
The multi-tiered roofs serve a brilliant environmental purpose. The steep pitch allows the heavy monsoon rain to shed off the building incredibly quickly.
And the gaps left between the overlapping roof tiers act as ventilation vents, allowing the trapped hot air to escape and pulling cross breezes through the shaded interior to keep the worshippers cool.
From the outside, it looks remarkably like a traditional Javanese or Hindu-Buddhist wooden pavilion.
But the interior space is completely reoriented. It faces the Qibla. The space is clear for communal prayer.
It serves the functional and theological requirements of a mosque perfectly while utilizing the wooden clothing of Southeast Asia.
We see a similar adaptation in China. The Great Mosque of Xi'an is a fascinating example.
If you approach the Great Mosque of Xi'an and walk through its exterior gates, it looks almost indistinguishable from a traditional Chinese Buddhist temple complex.
It features a sequence of courtyards aligned on a linear axis. It uses sweeping, tiled roofs with upturned eaves, and it relies heavily on traditional Chinese timber framing and joinery techniques.
But again, the skeleton beneath the Chinese timber framing is entirely Islamic.
The courtyards are aligned with the Qibla toward Mecca.
The interior beams, while carved and painted in a recognizable Chinese style, feature intricate Arabic calligraphy detailing Quranic verses instead of dragons or Buddhist figures.
What this geographic journey shows is that as long as the core functional and theological needs are met, the exterior skin of the building can completely absorb local cultural and material realities.
It explains how a single religious tradition could spread globally and immediately root itself in the local landscape, utilizing local craftsmen and local materials without demanding the impractical importation of foreign stone or rigid structural forms.
That adaptable skeleton brings us into the modern era. We have to examine what happens to these ancient principles when they collide with modern engineering.
Reinforced concrete, glass, computer-aided design, and steel framing.
The transition from traditional load-bearing masonry to modern structural frames changed the rules of architecture completely.
You are no longer constrained by the physical limits of a stone arch or the weight of a brick vault.
Reinforced concrete and steel allow architects to span massive, unprecedented distances and create entirely new geometries that were physically impossible for Sinan or the Mamluks.
A prime example of this break from traditional form is the Faisal Mosque in Islamabad, Pakistan.
The Faisal Mosque, designed in the late 1960s by a Turkish architect and completed in the 1980s, completely discards the traditional dome.
Because they were using the tensile strength of reinforced concrete, the architect was able to design an unconventional, multifaceted, sharply angled shell that looks like an enormous, stylized Bedouin desert tent set dramatically against the backdrop of the Margalla Hills.
The minarets also break from tradition. They are ultra-slender, lacking the traditional balconies, resembling modern rockets as much as they resemble classical towers.
It is a striking modern silhouette that fulfills all the special requirements of a mosque, but uses modern engineering to create a totally new geometry.
Now contrast that with the Sheikh Zayed Grand Mosque in Abu Dhabi, which was completed much more recently, in 2007.
The Sheikh Zayed Grand Mosque represents a different modern approach. Where the Faisal Mosque aggressively broke with traditional forms, the mosque in Abu Dhabi embraces them.
Massive domes, horseshoe arches, towering minarets, but executes them utilizing modern technologies, modern structural steel, and global supply chains on an unprecedented monumental scale.
It features vast expanses of brilliant white Macedonian marble, incredibly intricate floral inlays using semi-precious stones crafted by artisans from around the world, and massive crystal chandeliers hanging from the domes.
But crucially, it also integrates 21st century technology.
It features computer-controlled lighting systems that subtly change the color and intensity of the illumination on the exterior walls based on the lunar cycle, syncing the building to the phases of the moon.
It blends traditional mosaic craftsmanship with dynamic, immersive modern technologies to enhance the spiritual atmosphere of the space.
We also see revivalist movements stretching back to the 19th and 20th centuries.
As many post-colonial nations gained their independence, they sought to forge modern national identities.
They often looked back to their specific historical architectural heritage, whether that was Mamluk styles in Egypt or Moorish styles in North Africa.
They built massive new state mosques that visually reference those classic historical styles to assert cultural continuity, but they utilized modern concrete framing.
This allowed them to provide the vast, spacious, column-free interiors required for contemporary urban congregations.
And to integrate multifunctional civic areas like libraries, health clinics, and educational centers directly into the mosque complex, echoing the civic function of the early Abbasid complexes, but updating it for the modern city.
The tension contemporary architects face is profound. How do you honor ancient artistic practices and strict spiritual requirements while embracing modern advancements?
When a mosque is built primarily of glass and steel, with computer-controlled lighting, digital acoustics, and massive air conditioning systems? Does it risk losing its historical resonance?
Or is this just the natural next chapter in a tradition that has, as we've seen, always embraced new engineering?
If we look closely at the historical record we just covered, the early builders eagerly adopted Byzantine marble columns, Sasanian brick vaults, and local mud brick techniques when those were the most advanced or appropriate technologies available to them at the time.
Islamic architecture has never been a static, frozen artifact.
Therefore, utilizing structural steel, expansive glass, and digital lighting is entirely consistent with the tradition's historical willingness to adapt the absolute best available technology to serve the timeless requirements of the sacred space.
The technology changes, but the orientation and the purpose remain the same.
We have covered massive empires, intricate geometries, and soaring domes spanning across continents.
But before we finish, there is a final, highly vital aspect of this civilization's architecture that is often completely overlooked because it isn't always marked by a towering minaret.
We need to look at the invisible architecture.
Beyond the grand mosques and the marble tombs, we have to consider the architecture of survival.
In the arid climates of the Middle East and North Africa, the survival of these massive, dense urban centers required highly complex, often invisible engineering, specifically regarding water management.
A clear example of this is the sables of Cairo.
A sable is a public water fountain. They are often elaborately decorated, small architectural gems attached to the corner of a mosque, a madrasa, or standing independently at a busy intersection.
They were typically endowed by a wealthy patron or a ruler to provide free, clean drinking water to the public.
But the small, decorated stone room where you get the water is just the visible tip of the iceberg.
The architecture of the sable relies on a massive, hidden network of subterranean aqueducts, deep cisterns, and lead piping that supplied the water from the Nile or underground springs.
Building a sable represented the deep civic and social duty inherent in the culture. The architecture wasn't just about projecting power, it was about sustaining life.
So, the next time you look at a monumental building, whether it is a soaring stone dome or a complex of brick arches, consider not just how the columns stand up against gravity.
Consider how the building integrates into the daily survival and the social fabric of its environment.
How does it manage the brutal heat? How does it provide clean water to a dense neighborhood?
The true brilliance of architecture often lies in the invisible systems that allow the community around it to thrive.
We started by looking at a simple blueprint and expecting pure utility.
What we found instead is a highly adaptable spatial language that perfectly balances the contemplation of infinite divine order with the immediate practical and physical needs of the local community.
It is the ultimate synthesis of the sacred and the necessary, rendered in stone, mud, and wood. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.